All right, here we are, lesson number 2 of portion Vayetze. And of course, Vayetze means and he departed and he went. It's actually portion number 7 of the book of Genesis. And by the time you get to Vayetze, you've already studied and you've already read halfway through the book of Genesis. So if you've traveled with me thus far up to this point, thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. I know it's probably not the easiest thing in the world listening to some of these teachings, but I very much appreciate you having done so. And what we're going to talk about today is who it was that had departed in Vayetze, of course, that being Jacob. And we know that he is going to Laban to really kind of help preserve and conserve his life. We know with the earlier Torah portion and the last one from last week, he's on the run and he's being told by his parents, he's being told by his family, he needs to get out of Dodge because he's got a brother who's got an axe to grind and who wants to end his life. Esau was overheard saying, making the comment, the only reason my brother Jacob is still alive is because our dad is alive. Just as soon as Isaac's gone, Jacob's not going to be that far behind him. And so he is sent, Jacob is, to Laban. And we've kind of discussed a little bit about what happened already. And we're just continuing on with that thought. And we're going to take a look at a certain location, and this same location at different points in time, there is such a huge and vivid contrast. I want us to look at that, and then I also want us to take a look at the metamorphosis of Jacob's life in this chapter and a couple verses into the next, and really talk about how these chapters are a seedbed of so much frustration and dysfunction within the family of Israel. And so let's continue on in verse 1 of chapter 29 of Genesis. So Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. And he looked, and he saw a well in the field, and behold, there were 3 flocks of sheep that were lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks. And this is the same well that we looked at in Genesis 24 when the servant of Abraham came forward and was looking for a bride for Isaac. And of course, Jacob being the child of Isaac and the bride Rebekah. Keep that in mind as we go through. And it says that there was a large stone that was on the well's mouth. Now all of the flocks would be gathered there, and they would roll the stones from the well's mouth and water the sheep and put the stone back in its place. And of course, Jacob talks to these guys and wants to know, have you heard of Laban? They say yes. As a matter of fact, if you look up, yes, Laban's well. And in verse 6 it says, and look, Laban's daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep. And he said, look, I'll skip down to verse 9. It says, now while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, and she was a shepherdess. Now it came to pass that when Jacob saw Rachel the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, from the sheep of Laban from his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled a stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. So she ran and told her father. Then it came to pass that when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to the house. So he told Laban all of these things. And Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. And boy, oh boy, did that month turn into something a whole lot longer. And I already made reference about how this well is the same well that we encountered in Genesis 24. And in Genesis 24, we find that Abraham dispatches his servant, by all accounts, what seems to be that it was Eliezer. And he told Eliezer, go and find a bride for my wife, or for my son Isaac. And so Eliezer went. He took 10 camels, had spices, had gold, had all sorts of things, fruits. And it talks about how he went down to this place. He went, God showed him favor. These doors were opened. And it just seemed like the entire time he had the wind to his back. Everything was a breeze. Miraculously, the distance was something that just seemed to be a thing of absolutely no issue. And so whenever Eliezer took Rebekah, Laban kind of prospered off of this. Keep in mind that Rebecca, she was able to get this nose ring. She was able to get the shekels of gold that talks about there were 10 shekels. And Laban seen all of that. There's this guy with 10 camels who have spices, fruits, goods. There was gold given to this girl. Like, man alive, there's a lot that I could get out of this. And we find this in Genesis chapter 24 about how they were benefited just as much as Isaac was in a way to get a wife. Fast forward this next generation, Laban sees Jacob, who is the son of this union that he had already profited from, that he had already had benefits from, and he was all sorts of excited to see Jacob. But here's the thing. When Jacob came rolling into town and he had his crash landing, he didn't have 10 camels. He didn't have any servant. He didn't have any gold. What he did have was a willingness to roll the stone away from the well and start watering the sheep. And here's the thing about Jacob's life. He was somebody who beforehand, he dwelt in the tents. He studied the family's covenants. He looked at what it was to be an obligation to the God of Israel, what it required of me. What do I need to do as a son, as a man, to be a light to this world, to represent this God? We're going to find out that this 1 month that he stayed with Laban evolved into something about 20 years, and he became something he wasn't before, and that was a shepherd. Sometimes whenever you're growing in the process and becoming who it is that God has called you to be, you have to go through this metamorphosis and begin to do things you have absolutely never done before. And you will have to find out that the God that is the God of who you were whenever you dwelt in the tents is going to be the same God who is going to protect you in the fields as a shepherd and as a worker. I recall years ago, I wound up working at a call center for 2 years, and I've worked a lot of really cruddy jobs. That job at the call center for the 2 years, that is absolute bottom of the totem pole of anything I've ever done. I would rather go back to the merciless schedule I had working at a steel mill where I was working days, nights, days, nights, days, nights, all in 1 week. All 12-hour shifts. For many people there, it was 16-hour shifts, and they still had to be back in 8 hours to go ahead and complete another 16 hours or greater. But during my 2 years at this call center, even though it was just 8-hour days, man, it really truly made interacting with individuals something really difficult, because people over the phone are absolutely cruel and ruthless. And I wasn't working in something to where it was like a medical field where I was having to answer questions and seeing the people in the worst part of their life. It was a credit center. I was working for one of the three major credit bureaus. And after the 2 years, I wound up becoming blessed and having this job for 4 years that I can really liken to the experience of Jacob in a way. I worked at Acme Brick. It was 12-hour shifts, and there were moments of the day it was certainly hot. I was working beside kilns that were almost 2,000 degrees internally. And when I was hired on, I had a boss who told me, something happens to the kilns, rectify, take care of the situation, don't neglect your hourly paperwork. Otherwise, you're free to do whatever you want with your time. And I probably spent 11 and a half hours of my 12-hour shifts by myself, and I was able to, with the full blessing of my hiring supervisor, with the plant manager, everybody, I was able to study scripture for about 4 years. And boy, that's where I cut a lot of my teeth, beginning stages of learning some of the Hebrew, some of the stuff about the Bible as far as patterns and culture. And it was one of the most blessed times of my entire life. And it was absolutely beautiful. Like Jacob, I had my moments to where I was able to study in the tents, so to speak, and learn this God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I really felt like I was a cup. I felt like I was this barrel in the desert where I had so much being poured into me. But the thing about a barrel in the desert, if you're not able to be in a spot where you can give that necessary element to a bunch of other people, what good is it sitting on a gold mine of a barrel of water in a desert? After 4 years of working there, they shut down the doors of production, and I moved on with life. I was blessed with a job that paid a little bit better, paid a lot better after a couple of years. And within 6 months, I wound up becoming team lead, backup supervisor. There was a couple months where I was the supervisor, and I did not do everything perfect within the best of my abilities, but I was blessed with a job to where for 4 years I had that time to where I studied and was trying to relate to who it was to be a covenant person. And then God shifted me in my life to be in a position to where I was able to hopefully help display that and be able to work with other people and show people what it was like not to be a preacher to beat them over the head with the words of God and show these unrighteous such and such. Just no, that's ridiculous. That's silly. God was using me to show people what it was like and showing me what it was like to be a blessing to other people. And like I said, I didn't represent that in the best and greatest of ways all the time, but I worked hard. I had to become something I wasn't before. That was a part of my metamorphosis, a part of my growing stage in becoming of who God was calling me to be. And here's the thing, I never liked the pains that were associated with growing. Growing pains hurt, but growing pains brought me to greater heights to become a greater light to a lost and dying world. And I feel like, in ways, that this is what was going on with Jacob. So, getting back to scripture in verse 15, then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be? Now, Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, while the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And Laban said, and listen to exactly what his phraseology is. And Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. Now, did Laban say yes? I mean, he didn't say no. He said, it is better that you get her than anybody else. But he wasn't exactly complicit with the idea of Jacob working these 7 years for Rachel. It's better. He agreed with him on that front, but he was giving an indirect answer. He was being sly. He was being a sister switcher, as we will find out in just a few moments. And here's the thing that's interesting about it all. Why is Jacob in this current predicament? Because he hoodwinked his father and took the identity of his brother. Here we're going to find that the supplanter, this one that is the quote unquote deceiver, is about to be hoodwinked, and the younger is about to not be the one who he thinks it is, the one that he is going to be working for, the younger one. We see that there is a deception of not the brothers this time, but the sisters are switched out. And boy, talk about a dysfunctional family. This is nothing but an absolute seedbed with miracle grow of frustration and animosity. And I love what scripture says here. It says Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love that he had for her. Talks about how he went through what he did because he loved this woman so much. And I feel like it's relatable in one aspect, that whenever there is something that we have our soul absolutely tied to and anchored to, that if it's for a holy purpose, we can actually put our head down, do the work, and it doesn't seem like it's this huge time investment that it's day after day after day. You know, talking about when I worked at the steel mill, I'd wind up having to do 12-hour shifts, 9 consecutive nights in a row, get off at 7 o'clock in the morning, have to be back 7 o'clock in the morning the next day to start 9 days on days. I would literally work 18 out of 19 days with 24 hours off in the middle to go from a night shift to a day shift routine, then only to be off 36 hours, and then wind up going through and doing another X amount of days, only having just a couple days off a month with the days, night schedule. And with being a shepherd, The majority of your time is going to be on days, but there are wolves that are jumping up. There's things that are trying to take away from the flock, things that are trying to create life and death situations that you have to answer to at potentially any and all hours of the day. And just to think that Jacob loved Rachel so much, it just felt like a short amount of time. It felt like it was just maybe a week. If only we could have things in our life that we pursued to such a degree that we could weather any storm and it just feel like it was absolutely nothing. It's something I'm jealous of. Verse 21 says that Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go into her." And Laban gathered together all of the men and made a place and made a feast. Now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to Jacob, and he went in to her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this that you've done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me?" And Laban said, "It must not be done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and then we will give you this one also for the service in which you will serve me. Here's the condition. You want Rachel, you said you'd work 7 years for? Work another 7 years." He wound up having to work 14 years just to get the wife that he wanted and loved. And boy, by the time we come to the conclusion of chapter 29, we already see almost a destroyed engine because of the improper friction. And look at what Laban said too. It's not the custom that we give the younger before the elder. He was already working for 7 years. If it really truly was a custom, and Laban wasn't lying about this, that means almost everybody that he would have encountered in this 7 year process would have known, if they knew about what he was working for, that means everybody would have been lying to Jacob. People were conceiving or concealing the truth away from Jacob. But they were just going to allow this to happen. And it could be that a lot of these people didn't know. Maybe it was the truth that maybe Laban was lying. I don't know. But if it really truly was the custom of the land, that means everybody was watching Jacob as a joke. Think of the humiliation all parties would have felt. Jacob would have felt humiliated. I'm sure Rachel felt humiliated. And poor Leah, by the time we finish this chapter, we're going to know without a shadow of a doubt she herself is absolutely humiliated also. Let's go to verse 31. Then the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb. And I think we can honestly say it's not Leah's fault that what happened happened. And Jacob seemingly, he wasn't going to neglect his husbandly duties and, leave her without and let her not have children. But it says that even in the process of her having children, she wasn't loved. And again, Jacob wanted Rachel, wound up getting hoodwinked. And it's a no-win situation for all parties around. And if you read some of the Jewish writings, they actually say that Leah was supposed to have been given to Esau, who was the elder brother of Jacob. The elder brother and the elder sister would have been together, but whenever the hoodwink had happened and take place, then Jacob had to take that sister along with the one that he was ultimately, quote unquote, destined for, that being Rachel. And I don't know if that's just a little bit of a reach, but one thing I will say in regards to that is when you read the handful of chapters prior to Vayetze, you will find that Esau had multiple wives, and you'll find that these wives were like smoke to the eyes of Isaac and Rebekah. They were a burr under the saddle. They were a burden. They were an absolute point of contention with mom and dad. And by the time Esau wisens up, recognizes what's going on, talks to mom and dad about this being an issue, what does he do? He goes and gets another wife. And so we see already that Esau isn't really going a part of the plan. He's not streamlining himself into this situation of blessing. We find that he's creating this multiplicity of problems. And whenever he finds out that what he's doing is wrong, he doubles down and takes even more on wife-wise. And it's like I've heard a teacher say, it's like he had a headache take a little bit of aspirin. Oh, well, that doesn't help the situation, so let's take the whole bottle. We are multiplying situations and creating more chaos, and then creating even more separate problems in the process. We're putting gasoline on the fire. And that's what we find Esau having done. And so maybe that's true what we take a look at, that Leah should have went with Esau, but because of what happened, whatever, we find that it didn't happen. Back to 31, it says, Leah was unloved, and so the Lord opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And listen to the names of the 4 sons that Leah had, and look at the metamorphosis that Leah herself experienced. It says, so Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, or Reuben, for she said, the Lord has surely looked at my affliction, now therefore my husband will love me. Reuben, it's a contraction of 2 words, or a compound word. It's Ru, Ben. Ru means behold, Ben means son. And when he sees the son, he's going to love me. Verse 33 says, then she conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved. Reuben didn't get the trick done. I'm still unloved. But now that I've conceived again, the Lord has heard that I am unloved, and therefore he's given me the son also. And she called his name Simeon, which comes from the word Shema, which means to hear. The Shema being the very first prayer a Jewish child learns. O hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. It comes from Shema, hearing. She conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me. He's beheld a son. He's heard I've given him a second son. He is going to be absolutely in love, attached with me, because here's son number 3. I will call him by the name of Levi. Then we roll up onto verse 35, and it says, and she conceived again and bore a son and said, now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. There came a point in time that while the situation was not at all fair to Leah and what she was dragged into and what she was thrown into, something that was right about the situation was even that despite the frustration, despite the emotional neglect, despite her not being favored and loved in a way that she should have been, she didn't stay and run herself into the ground. She decided that she was going to praise God. And here's the thing about the whole scenario, the whole situation. She has Judah, which means praise. I had a teaching I posted, I don't know who would have even heard it necessarily. We don't realize how close Judah is to the God of Israel just by the spelling of the name in English. And what I mean by that is, if you hear in English, we have Yahweh, we have Jehovah. That's what it's called, the Tetragrammaton, the holy 4-letter name of God. Yud, He, Vav, He. This Tetragrammaton and Judah are absolutely identical in spelling, but with one difference. And that is Judah has one extra letter. That is the letter Dalet. And the letter Dalet means door. When Messiah was to come, he was going to step into this world through the tribe of Judah. Judah was going to be used as a door to where Messiah physically would step into this world and be like God to the people. Almost in a sense, it's a beautiful thing to me in my mind. And just the spelling of Judah shows that God was going to enter this world through that tribe. If we want God to be present in a situation, even when it's glum and it is bleak, what do? We need to put our foot forward and put praise, because God inhabits the praise of his people. And Leah was in a gut-wrenching situation. And thankfully, she had the wherewithal to realize that praise was going to get her through. And praise also will get us through. Whenever we take a look at these forward chapters that are to come, we're going to find a lot of strife. We're going to find a lot of frustration. We're going to find a lot of animosity. For those who already know the story, it's a little bit of a repeat, but we're going to find later on that Joseph is going to come into play. And why was Joseph so absolutely hated by his brethren, by his brothers? It's because a lot of what's already started and happened within this generation with Jacob, with Esau, with Rachel, with Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah. It's an absolute chaotic field. It is dysfunction that does, while it has the word fun and dysfunction, there's not a lot of fun going on. For these 14 years that Jacob wound up agreeing to work and then wound up working another 6 on top of it, for the 20 years that he wound up labored and he became this shepherd, the part of his evolution of character, it was all for this one woman. It was for Rachel. And who did Rachel birth? When you take a look at these 12 tribes of Jacob that became Israel, and like I said, the 12 tribes, 6 of them came from Leah, 2 came from Bilhah, 2 came from Zilpah, and 2 came from Rachel. The firstborn of the woman that he loved was by the name of Joseph. And we wonder why Joseph was so hated by his brother, because he was the apple of his father's eye. He had this blessing. He got the coat of many colors. He was the one that got to give the report on all of the other brothers. Why was that? Because he was the first fruit of the 20 years of labor of what he wanted to have, and the woman he wanted to have, the woman that he lost in the childbirth of their second son. When Jacob would look at Joseph, he would see the wife that he had lost, that he had so much favor for, and dealt with a ton of bad weather and frustration. That's why a lot of the brothers, some of the sisters as well, they could not be held in comparison to Joseph, because Joseph belonged to Rachel, and the rest of them, other than Benjamin, did not. There were things that Jacob got right, and there were definitely things that Jacob got wrong. I'm not defending every action and every decision. Matter of fact, if you go to Genesis 30, look at the first couple, just the first 2 verses. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." You know what's astounding? Go back to Abraham and Sarah. What was the big thing they struggled with? They struggled with very prolonged infertility. And eventually God blessed them. They prayed, God blessed them. They were able to have a child. They had Isaac. What did Isaac and Rebekah face? They faced 20 years of infertility. Jacob winds up having to work for Laban for 20 years, that same duration, that same period amount of time. His mother and father toiled not being able to have a pregnancy. And then when they did, it was twins that were warring within the womb. But how was it that Isaac and Rebekah were able to have that pregnancy to begin with after those 20 years of infertility? Isaac entreated and he went on behalf of his wife and he prayed to God and asked for that blessing. Thus came Jacob and Esau. Fast forward all the way to the beginning of chapter 30, just like Abraham and Sarah, just like Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel experience a period of infertility. And what does Jacob say here? His response to Rachel saying, "Give me children or I die." Jacob's response was anger. And he aroused his anger against his wife that he worked so hard for, Rachel. Again, he's already frustrated with everything going on. I can understand that, but that does not give us a free pass and ticket to lash out at our wives. The New Testament tells us our prayers could actually be hindered from reaching the ears of God if we do not treat our wives well and with the respect and the manner that they deserve. Even if we're in a frustration and a point to where it's not necessarily our fault we're in situations that we're in, they are very much created in the image of God just as much as we are. Us together, our union perpetuates a greater image of God, creates another generation. And Jacob's response was anger. And he said, "Am I in the place of God who's withheld from you fruit of this womb?" He had the example of his mother and his father who went before God and prayed and asked of God to open her womb to where we have Jacob and have Esau as a result. We can get things right and we can get things wrong. And even though Jacob didn't follow the example of his father Isaac and ask God, I see this as where he hit a brick wall and he didn't do it right. I can be smart enough and realize I don't have to do the same thing Jacob does. I could go through the door instead of trying to go through the wall. And here's the thing, we know of the frustration that Joseph is going to face. I want you to think of it this way. Joseph had brethren, and he had several of his brothers that wanted to kill him. And I want you to think of this from the perspective of both Jacob and Joseph. Joseph had brothers who wanted to kill him, and the only reason they decided they weren't going to kill him was because they could at least sell him off and make enough money to buy a pair of shoes. Sad but true. He wound up being sold as a slave, having to work for people in a land that he didn't know, perhaps a language he didn't originally know, had to learn hardships through all of that, finally found his footwork, finally was grounded and had his own feet to stand on. He winds up getting thrown into prison because of a false accusation of, well, he tried to accost me. He was falsely accused of sexual assault. Wound up losing everything all over again. Wound up in the slums, wound up in the pits. And he wound up being forgotten in the pits of somebody he wound up giving a bit of relief to. And eventually, yes, everything all worked out. Everything that the brothers had meant for evil, Joseph said God used for good. And we understand that. But had Jacob done what his father Isaac had done to begin with, would Joseph have felt all of this turmoil, all of this animosity, all of this pure, unadulterated hatred that his brothers had towards him? Because what happened here? Rachel wasn't able to have children. And so what did they do? They kind of did the same thing Abraham Sarah did and gave the handmaid over, and he had children through her. We take a look that Bilhah was given by Rachel, and he had children through her. He wound up having 2 sons through Bilhah. And so we find the other sisters see this example played out, and she gives Zilpah to Jacob, and he has children through her. And it's almost like this hatred that we find all the way back in Abraham and Sarah to where Ishmael and Hagar, it's almost in a sense, a lot of that situation we're playing and spiraling out of control here. Had Jacob, instead of a knee-jerk reaction acting out of anger, but acted in humility and went to God and asked God to open Rachel's womb like he did his mother's, like he did Sarah's, perhaps all of this suffering wouldn't have played out as it was. And I know there's no such thing as what might have been, this phrase and says, but me as a father of a child, having the burden of knowing that if I would have just prayed God's favor for my wife, just the result of that with my children, maybe my son wouldn't have had to be sent off to Egypt after nearly getting murdered, being sold as a slave, being falsely accused. Everything that spiraled out of control, and just again, like it was said later on, like I've already said, what these people meant for evil, for harm, for damage, God was able to use it all. Thank God that God is the God he is, that he is able to take and convert all of that nastiness into something good. And like I said before, this is a part of the metamorphosis that Joseph had to go through in that story. For what we've already read about, this is part of the metamorphosis that Jacob had to go through. There is a growth period that we all have to go through. Jacob went from studying in tents and had to become a shepherd to become ultimately who God needed him to become. I have to go through changes in my life to become who God is calling me to be. And as I said before, I never liked the growing pains. But the growing pains brought me to greater heights to become a greater light to this lost and dying world. And so, as always, I strongly advise you to read the rest of the portion, study up, and get ready for what we have next week. And there might be some additional teachings I've got coming on. I'm not exactly sure. We're going to continue every weekend as best I can with my crazy more than full-time work schedule. I'm actually working about 75 hours over the course of 7 days. And so wanted to have the opportunity to jump on here and record. And if any questions, comments, if there's some things coming down the way in Genesis through Deuteronomy that you want me to touch base with, please let me know. There might be something I'm able to uncover and hopefully be a blessing to you. And as always, thank you for your time. Be blessed.